Since this animation project is a follow-up to a previous animation, I don't have to start from scratch in Blender. I can open one of the final files from that animation and start from there with a camera already set up, aspect ratio set up, as well as characters and props in the scene. So let's go find that file. I remember shot 2 was the 16:9 ratio, where shot 1 was the extreme wide angle, lighting was the final stage, and then sort by date. So this one right here is the latest file. Let's open that up and hit Shift-Z in the viewport so we can see what that Christmas animation looked like. As you can see, a very wide angle, which we want to keep, as well as the general camera placement and the characters. All I need to do to create a prototype scene is swap out the environment and change up the lighting accordingly. So I want to save this file, but not in the Christmas project directory. But I want to start a new project directory here in my source folder. Now, because I'm recording a tutorial, I have these other directories, one of them being the original Halloween animation project, but just try to ignore those. I'm going to recreate the project for the purposes of this course. So this new directory that I'm creating will be called microshort as a prefix _ Melvin Halloween 2018. This is the new project directory that will house all of our blend files, textures, library files, caches, all that good stuff. So the next level, we need to have a few directories. Number one, we're going to have a library folder, or lib for short. Now in the library, I'm going to store master character files, prop files, environment files, and anything else that we would want to link into a final assembled scene. This is a common way to set up a larger animation project with a team. And even though there's not a widespread standard, meaning names of folders and exact structure, the concepts are fairly standard for an animation production like this. So we've got our library folder. The next one we'll create is going to be shots. And for this particular short, it's only going to be one shot. But if it were a larger project, all my shots would be stored individually in here. And these shots are assembled from elements in our library. And then finally, one more I'm going to create called pre, and this is where our prototype file is going to live. This is preliminary Blender files that will eventually be broken up into library files and then reassembled as shots. And so the scene I'm creating right now is going in the pre folder. And we can call this Melvin Halloween Prototype 01. And let's save that file. Now, currently, it's sourcing library files from the Christmas directory, which is not good. It's not an organized approach. So I'm going to switch over to our Finder, and I'm going to copy the Christmas directory, or the library specifically, the lib folder. I'm just going to copy that and paste it inside our microshort lib. I'm just going to, well, overwrite that file. As you can see, it's asking me to overwrite it. That's fine. And now I want to reassociate the linked files into my new project directory rather than the old Christmas directory. And this is kind of a hacker way to do this. But if I go back to our Christmas directory, I'm just going to change the title here, just temporary. And now when I revert this file, yes, we're missing our library character and prop. But if I go to File, External Data, Find Missing Files, and then go to our library and Find Missing Files, and I wonder if I need to save the file. There we go. Now they appear in our scene again, and the environment didn't disappear because that's a different folder outside of both projects, but I probably should put an HDRI inside the project folder, just to be safe. Now, there is a little bit of weirdness with Melvin. He's not in that same pose, and I'm not exactly sure what causes that, but the animation does get a little busted. That doesn't matter to me, honestly. I just want the characters in the scene. I want to create a prototype render. It's fine with him in this goofy pose, and when I pass it over to Wayne, he is going to correct everything within the rigs and linking, so I'm not particularly worried about it. But at this point, we are ready to begin creating our new environment. And the first thing I want to do is find a better environment texture. Now, right now we're looking at an HDRI, which I will be switching, but specifically I want this to look like a forest scene. And I'm not going to find an HDRI exactly matching that forest environment. I'm going to have to pick one myself and set that up manually. So again, looking in the frame, I want to think about how this scene can be set up. Now, the biggest bang for my buck that I learned from the Christmas project is that you can get a lot by a simple plane with reflections combined with depth of field to blur out the background and the edge of the plane and blur that together with the environment texture. And that creates a very convincing, complete world with very few objects in the scene. The only difference with this one is I'm going to use this plane idea with reflections, but instead of a frozen lake, it's going to be a pond. And then the background of that pond is going to be a forest. So right now I want to find a forest, and then I will adjust our shader on the plane accordingly. So I'm going to jump over to my Chrome browser and head over to pixabay.com. Now you should be familiar with this if you've watched any of my training or live streams. I use Pixabay and this site called Pexels all the time. They are CC0 public domain images, well, stock photos really. And I'm going to start with Pixabay, see what they have in store. And I'm looking for woods. How about dark woods? See what we get from that search. Now this kind of atmosphere is what I'm going for. Creepy, spooky, kind of hazy and foggy, but it also needs to match a certain criteria. This one right here doesn't work because the camera angle is from bottom to top, and that's just not going to match the scene that we're creating. We need it to be a similar perspective. Now this one could potentially work, but it actually looks more like a zoom lens, whereas actually this is more what I'm thinking of. If we look at that one, yeah, see this one, I think I can imagine a section of this forest in the background for our scene back here. And so these trees would show up really nicely in the reflections. We've got this great fog that I think can serve as like moonlight. And yeah, this is probably my favorite out of what we've seen so far. So let me just middle mouse click on that to open it in a new tab, see if there's anything else. This could maybe work. It's a little bit too contrasty. Another thing I'm looking for is kind of a neutral, more of a neutral color palette, because I can adjust those colors how I want, but something like this is going to be harder to adjust because it's already so contrasted. This one I really love the vibe, but it does look more like daytime rather than nighttime, and the camera angle is off. So let's see. Download or just view that image in its full resolution. Awesome. Now we can save it. Go right back to that project file. And we're going to go to Source, Microshort Melvin. And perhaps here I'll create a new directory called Text. And this is where I'll store all of our texture files. At least for now. Maybe Wayne wants them in a different spot. But to get the ball rolling, let's call it Forest BG for background. Excellent. Now we can jump back over to Blender and set up an image plane for this new texture. So we'll add Shift-A Mesh Plane. And then let me open the file because I want the resolution of my plane, the dimensions of my plane to match our texture. So image, not create a new one, open image, go find that in the texture folder. And then in the in panel, it will tell us our resolution. Wait a minute, that's a lot smaller than I was expecting. Ah, there we go. Now that's the full resolution. The reason I want the full resolution is to just give me the most options for which section of the overall image to use. And you'll see what I mean in just a moment. Let me save it out, save it over this file. Go back to Blender, reload it. There we go. That's my full resolution. So for my plane, let's make it 928 by 3264. All right, so it's going to be massive, absolutely huge. I can just scale down now to like 0.01, and this will represent the size of our image down here. And the reason I'm using a plane in this situation, again, is so that I can art direct exactly what the background image looks like. and not have to depend on the HDRI. They're going to work together rather than in this Christmas scene, the HDRI was the lighting as well as the environment texture. But in this case, I want to be a little more specific with the background. And so with that set up, let's see, I do have, so since this is leftover from animation, I do have this auto key turned on. Just going to turn that off, and I don't want any keys. I don't want to start setting in any animation keys. And I do want this image to face directly at my camera. So I'm going to select the plane, select the camera, and then Alt-click on each one of these values and just hit Enter. And that will essentially copy the values of a rotation from the camera to this plane. And now, yeah, it should be set up directly in line with the camera, directly perpendicular to the camera. All right, so with my plane selected, let's create the material. I'm just going to call this BG for background. And we are using cycles. Excellent. The surface is going to be an emission. I don't need any shading information. I just want this to show the full brightness of the image. And let's switch this bottom window, bottom panel to the node editor. And this is my compositing files from the Christmas scene. That might come in handy. We don't need that right now. But in the material properties, let's hit Shift-A, texture and image texture, and we can grab the forest BG, plug that in. Let's look at the render. And let's see, do I need texture coordinates perhaps? Yeah, it looks like I did. But now you can see it. The texture is working perfectly. And now it's just a matter of lining it up. But we have a couple things to think about. For one, the ground plane, we are going to use this idea because it is very powerful. Just using a reflective plane, be it an ice pond right here, or be it a fluid pond, we get a lot of mileage out of a very simple scenario. And remember, we're trying to do everything with the least amount of effort, most amount of impact. So instead of modeling any of the forest, modeling any of the ground, we're going to go simple but effective with a pond reflective surface. So I need to select the pond and adjust its material to be a lot more simple than this. We don't need any of this stuff. We just need it to be reflective. So with this, we can turn the base color of this principled BSDF down to black. There we go. Already it's starting to look more like a pond scene. And yeah, that's going to look pretty good. But it doesn't need to be directly on Melvin's feet. We can move it down because it's going to be a surface below Melvin's feet. You know, he's going to be walking on kind of a pier situation. So let's see how far down to ballpark. I think something like this would make sense. All right, now what does that do to like the horizon? That doesn't look bad. I do think right now maybe the pond feels a little bit too big. Like the line of water goes right up into the trees. And so it might make more sense to kind of scale this down. Not that plane, but the ground plane. Not the ground plane, the pond plane. And you can see as I scale it, the overall pond does feel a little bit smaller. But we do have something to think about. So depth of field plays a big role in this situation to feel believable. Because we don't ever want to see a hard edge on this pond object. And we want the depth of field to very smoothly blur out the edge of the pond with the background. Right now it all looks kind of blurred in general, so I'm wondering if my roughness is a little bit too high. Maybe not. Let's go to 0.05. Okay, that's starting to clear up a little bit. But I think what I really need to do is adjust the edge of the plane itself. So I need to tab into edit mode and mess around with some of these edges. Now, I don't really need that at all. I'm going to move these points around to try and break up the surface and create a little bit more interest into the edge of the water. Making sure to keep it flat, so never moving in the Z-axis. If I ever need to make new edges, that's not a big deal. This is not going to be something that's seen. It's just going to be completely utilitarian. And this might seem weird, but this is honestly one of the beautiful things about computer graphics is you can fake so much of this stuff and get a lot more bang for your buck with less effort. All right, so I'm gonna scale it in X. All right, let's see what that looks like. Yeah, see, now we're getting more play in the pond edge. It's not so flat like it was before. All right, I think that looks pretty good. Now, what will actually make it look like a pond is not being so glass smooth. We need to break it up with some waves. And I'm going to create those waves with the Voronoi texture. So Shift A, Texture, Voronoi. And we're going to plug that into the displacement to serve as a bump map. So if we plug that in right away, well, let's just use the factor. We see a little bit of breakup on the surface, but clearly the scale is too big. Let's go to 200. We also need to add a converter math node to adjust the strength. And we'll multiply it by like 0.1. All right, so here's where we can start to get some interesting wave patterns. Let's go for a scale of 100, maybe even 50. Okay, that's not bad. And then I'm going to add another one, Shift D to duplicate it. And let's make this one 100. And we're going to mix them. And we'll leave it at 0.5. Let's crank up the value to like 0.2 so we can see it a little bit more clearly. And yeah, these two combined makes it look a lot more believable. Now, with this particular scene, I'm wondering if the depth of field is a little bit too high. So with my camera selected, let's go to those property settings, and we can clear the keyframes here. We'll leave the distance as is, but then, well, let me make sure the distance is what I am expecting. Yeah, okay, that's fine. And then for the radius, let's cut it down by half, 0.05. Let's see if that still holds up. The background was just a little too blurred for me. Although here, you know, the edge of the water is a little bit too obvious. So maybe what I need to do is kind of move it backward in the scene. Maybe scale it that way. I do wonder if that's messing up these. Let me Control A, apply the scale. See what that does to the shader. Oh, it actually does a lot. It does invert our waves. What if we just flip it over? There we go. Now we've got our proper waves again. And since I scaled the pond plane backward, we are getting more blur along the edge, which I like. But it is a little bit too high in the environment right now. So what if we try and rotate the camera down according to the cursor as our pivot point? Yeah, rotating that down just a little bit does a lot. Brings down the edge of the pond, and then we can move our image texture up a bit of our forest, something like that. There we go. Yeah, that's feeling pretty good. Awesome. So we've got the core ingredients set up. The only thing we're missing is a pier, but while I'm at it, I might as well adjust the colors of our environment texture and also choose a new HDRI to match. Right now, the forest texture looks like a daytime scene, and I want it to look like a nighttime, more moonlit scene. So let's click on that object, take a look at the material, and we just need to add some color adjustment nodes, like how about an RGB curves to kind of crush the darks, brighten the brights a little bit, essentially just adjusting the contrast. And then do similarly to the red. I want less red in the darks, though maybe not that extreme. And then more into a nighttime range. For an HDRI, let's select a better one than the current, which is that winter scene. So it's actually a lot of light. We want a lot less light. So let's just find that texture and replace it. And so I have a collection of HDRIs, and these are CCBY. Let's look at their thumbnails. And so I'm not looking for daytime ones. Here's a forest. Maybe we could adjust the levels, but maybe we won't need that. What about one of these clearly nighttime scenes? Let's try this one. Okay, let's look at the orientation. All right, so the sun, well, the moonlight I guess that's probably like a sunset kind of thing. It's coming from the screen left direction where we want it to come from screen right. So we need to adjust the orientation. And coming from that existing Christmas scene, we already have the nodes we need. So let's take that down to 0. Something more like this, I think, will work better. Yeah, I think we're off into the right direction. I'm going to save our scene. And in the next lesson, I'll model a pier, which is probably the hardest part of the environment. But once we have that, all the elements in the scene will be there, and we can finalize this prototype.